So, this week in the Sacred Gathering, we're going to continue our series that I'm calling Voices from the Wilderness. The reminder that in the Bible, the wilderness represents not, like pristine, beautiful nature, as it will for many of us in Colorado, or the kind of the post romantic idea of nature as unspoiled and unruined. But nature, wilderness, represents real danger to them, whether it's the danger of being out in the desert and maybe there's not going to be enough food or water and you can die. Maybe it's attacks from wild animals or bandits, people that live out there. But it's also got this kind of connotation of the spiritual or the dangerous, the other, because it was believed the place in which monsters and things outside of the human realm or demons might find you as well. And yet there's this theme in the Bible of God showing up again and again to provide for his people, even in places of wilderness, of teaching very special things. So last week we looked at Moses and God kind of teaching this important lesson that holiness, goddishness, is not something to be hidden away in temples. It is something that can show up anywhere and in any circumstances as long as God is willing to be there. We're going to look at kind of another lesson in these voices from the wilderness when we look at this very famous incident of Moses meeting with God again on Mount Sinai. So a little bit of background, kind of where we're at in the biblical story overall. So kind of after Moses in this encounter with God, God is going to continue to form his people, his holy people, right? To kind of teach them that they are meant to be kind of a first fruits, kind of a show of what God is like in the world. And this is often kind of a failed relationship. They tend to choose the desire to be like everybody else, to worship in safer ways than to carry this amazing identity as God's own people. And so God starts kind of wooing them, starts calling back to them with these voices that are often associated with wilderness, these outsiders called prophets that in many ways Elijah is kind of the archetype of. So early in his days, the big kind of problem they were having at the time was worshiping a storm god, a fertility god of Baal. And so God sends this wild man Elijah to say, no, um, this God is not going to be enough. I'm declaring a drought, and you are all going to have to suffer because this God is not going to be enough. He cannot force it to rain when he wants. And then Elijah disappears back out into the wilderness where God very literally provides for him. And then after this drought has kind of set the table, Elijah shows back up, challenges all these prophets of this god Baal to a contest, saying, okay, everybody, let's see who God actually is. And so they set up an altar, he sets up an altar, and he says, whichever God is capable of raining fire down from heaven in the most, obvious and spectacular of signs, that's going to be the true God in which we follow. And then afterwards, God promises to end the drought. So they do their best. They try to get the attention of Baal. Nothing happens. Elijah, of course, prays. Fire comes down from heaven. And the people and Elijah turn on all these false prophets who've been leading them the wrong direction. They kill them all. And Elijah thinks that he's in this great moment of victory in which the people are going to re enter their identity as God's people, not Baal's people. But sadly, the patron, the god, I'm sorry, the queen who's been promoting all this Baal worship, Jezebel, has other plans, and we're going to see the story take a very different direction than I think Elijah thought it was going to. So I'm reading from 1 Kings chapter 19. Ahab the king told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, how he had killed all Baal's prophets with the sword. Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah with this message: may the gods do whatever they want to me if by this time tomorrow I haven't made your life just like the life of one of them. Elijah was terrified. He got up and ran for his life. He arrived at Beersheba in Judah and left his assistant there. He then went further on into the desert, a day's journey. He finally sat down under a solitary broom bush. He longed for his own death. It's more than enough, Lord. Take my life because I'm no better than my ancestors. He lay down and slept under the solitary bush tree. Then suddenly, A messenger tapped him and said, "Get up, eat something." Elijah opened his eyes and saw flatbread baked on glowing coals and a jar of water by his head. He ate and drank, and then went back to sleep. The Lord's messenger returned a second time and tapped him. "Get up." The messenger said, "Eat something, because you have a difficult road ahead of you." Elijah got up, ate and drank, and went refreshed by that food for 40 days and nights until he arrived at Horeb, God's mountain. There he went into a cave and spent the night. The Lord's word came to him and said, "Why are you here, Elijah?" Elijah replied, "I've been very passionate for the Lord God of heavenly forces, because the Israelites have abandoned your covenant. They have torn down your altars, they've murdered your prophets with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they want to take my life too." The Lord said, "Go out and stand at the mountain before the Lord. The Lord is passing by." A very strong wind tore through the mountains and broke apart the stones before the Lord, but the Lord wasn't in the wind. And after the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord wasn't in the earthquake. After the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord wasn't in the fire. After the fire, there was a sound, thin, quiet. Then Elijah heard it. He wrapped his face in his coat. He went out and stood at the cave's entrance, and a voice came to him and said, "Why are you here, Elijah?" He said, "I've been very passionate for the Lord God of heavenly forces, because the Israelites have abandoned your covenant. They have torn down your altars. They've murdered your people with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they want to take my life too." The Lord said to him, "Go back through the desert to Damascus and anoint Hazael as king of Aram. Also anoint Jehu, Nimshi's son, a king of Israel, and anoint Elisha from Abel Melthel, Shaphat's son, to succeed you as prophet. Whoever escapes the sword of Hazael, Jehu will kill. Whoever escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha will kill. But I have preserved those who remain in Israel, totaling 7,000, all those whose knees haven't bowed down to Baal and whose mouths haven't kissed him." So the beginning of the story, I think, comes as something of a shock to Elijah, right? He thought he had won. He's seen fire fall from heaven. Everyone rallies to his side. This is supposed to be his big moment of victory, right? But I think he underestimates just how much maybe investment people often have. I think many of us believe that, like, if God would just show himself, just do something huge and spectacular, nobody would be able to deny that God is real and that we should value his ways of being in the world. But I think, like Elijah does, we simply underestimate people's kind of investment in the way things are. So Jezebel is, she is promoting. She's a foreigner. She's promoting the worship of her god from back home. A lot of people think she is likely a priestess of Baal herself, since there were a lot of priestesses in that time, especially in I think it's Sidon, where she's from. So she comes promoting this thing in which she is an expert, in which she really believes. And it is going to take more than, I think, this proof for her to back down. She has, as the queen, a lot of face to lose. And so she immediately threatens Elijah. And I think in his mind, maybe he wins. He thinks this is the big moment. And yet we have to recognize that people often have a lot of reasons to stick to their guns, to stay with their beliefs, even beliefs that we think maybe are harmful to them or mistaken. They didn't get there sometimes by accident. Sometimes it's a choice. Sometimes they just have so much to lose by admitting that they were wrong, that even fire falling from the sky is not going to be enough to convince someone to change, or that God is right and that they aren't, etc. I think another interesting piece of this story is when Elijah is afraid and disappointed and confused by the results of this, what does he immediately do? We don't hear anything about him being told by God to just take off and head south, to return back to the wilderness. I suspect that whereas most people find the wilderness frightening at this time, this is a place that is comfortable to him, because this is a place that God has provided for him in the past. And so in some ways, I think Elijah is retreating to what is familiar, to what feels safe, to the place he's seen God before, even though I suspect God is interested in doing some new work in his heart and the people around them. Elijah is kind of retreating to what he's seen before, what worked in the past. And I think God uses this, but I think it's something we all have to be a little careful of when the chips are down, trying to kind of get back that old feeling, to use the old things, to return to a part of the past. Because many times in this journey of life, we need to be moving forward and seeing what God is up to in front of us, not always looking to the past. So I could be wrong on that, but I think it's a warning we all need to take seriously. And so this next section, kind of before this famous incident at the cave, I think is actually really important to the way the story is told overall, though we often skip it just because it seems a little strange that he falls asleep and that this food is coming. So let me read it one more time. He lay down and slept under a solitary broom tree. Then suddenly a messenger or an angel tapped him and said to him, "Get up, eat something." Elijah opened his eyes and saw flatbread baked on glowing coals and a jar of water by his head. He ate and drank and then went back to sleep. The Lord's messenger returned a second time and tapped him. "Get up," the messenger said. "Eat something, because you have a difficult road ahead of you." Elijah got up, ate and drank, and went refreshed by that food for 40 days and nights until he arrived at Horeb, God's mountain. Again, Horeb translating directly to wilderness, the exact name that was given to this mountain when God met Moses there. There he went into a cave and spent the night. The Lord's word came to him and said, "Why are you here, Elijah?" And Elijah replied, "I've been very passionate for the Lord God of heavenly forces, because the Israelites have abandoned your covenant. They have torn down your altars. They have murdered your prophets with the sword. I'm the only one left. And now they want to take my life too." And so um, we hear Elijah's complaint, right? He says, I'm it. I'm the only one who is left. I'm a failure. Um, I'm alone. Just let me die. And I think this interpretation of what is going on, that he's a failure, that he's been forsaken by God, that all his work has come to nothing, is interesting because God obviously does not agree with this interpretation. God is continuing to work with him, God is continuing to sustain him. And it's ironic because, as dramatic and as famous as this story is of Elijah calling down fire from heaven, I actually think this next story of him meeting God in the cave is one that is even more famous. I think it's even more well known and well regarded and more useful to us. And so while Elijah feels like he's useless and a failure, he's actually ramping up. Based on God's sustenance, the fact God is still taking care of him, he's ramping up for what is probably going to be the culminating moment of his life and his experience. He feels like a total failure at his absolute lowest, and God is sustaining him and preparing him for what is likely the most important moment of his life. I think it can give us perspective when we are in those places, when we feel alone, when we feel like failures, when maybe we need to pay better attention and see what God is actually up to, which again, if he's paying attention, he can know God is continuing to take care of him and sustain him even in the wilderness, as he has done all along in his experiences with God. And so then we come to this very famous, beautiful passage. "And so the Lord said, 'Go out and stand at the mountain before the Lord. The Lord is passing by.' A very strong wind tore through the mountains and broke apart the stones before the Lord, but the Lord wasn't in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord wasn't in the earthquake. After the earthquake there was fire, but the Lord wasn't in the fire. And after the fire there was a sound, thin, quiet. Then Elijah heard it. He wrapped his face in his coat. He went out and stood at the cave's entrance, and a voice came to him, 'Why are you here, Elijah?'" So this setting is very interesting. As I pointed out, this is happening again at Horeb, the mountain of God, which there's some dispute. Is this another name for Sinai? Is it just the wilderness? But either way, we know this is where Moses met God as fire, right? And fire is part of this. Each of these earthquakes, these blasting winds, these spectacular representations of who God is and all his glory and his power are here. And yet Elijah recognizes that is not how God is speaking to him at this moment. It's an interesting contrast based on the place where God has met with Moses in fire. And in fact, there are some translations that point out it's not just a cave, but there some of the older texts tell us it's the cave. It's very possibly he is standing exactly in the same spot Moses was when he met God. And yet, it seems like God is wanting to teach something new about his relationship to humanity in this famous story. God is not always in the obvious or the spectacular. If anything, Elijah seems like he's maybe a little addicted to that, right? He expects God to move in these big, huge ways, which has been his experience of God, especially recently um, in the incident of the fire falling from heaven. But I think this passage is one of the kind of just archetypal images of a very different view of God, one that I think is all over the place in the Bible, and yet which we often don't really want to hear. We like to think of God as big and obvious and powerful and spectacular. God is those things, but I think that tends to be more the exception more than the rule. As we look in the Bible, God tends to be in things that are quiet. God tends to be in things that are subtle. God's work tends to be slow and gradual and easy to miss. God tends to be among those things that are weak and unimpressive rather than the big and the glorious. Does God have the right to use those things? Absolutely. But I don't think that's the general trend. I don't think that's what God is generally trying to teach us. And so I think he is offering to both Elijah and to all of us who may prefer the big, the loud, the spectacular, that his ways tend to be a little more subtle. We have to know how to listen. We have to have the ears to hear. We have to have the eyes to see, right? I was talking with someone recently who's an avid bird watcher, and I was very struck by a similarity here in maybe having the right eyes to see, right? And I think I said something along the lines of, okay, so you're an avid bird watcher, right? He's like, does it frustrate you that people don't see the birds that are around? They don't know as much as you do. They just look and see, oh, that's a bird, that's a bird. They don't know the information, how their migratory patterns are, where you might find them or hear the songs. They can't identify them. And he said, it doesn't annoy me so much that people can't identify or know that much about birds. He's like, most people don't even see birds. They don't know that they're there. They don't recognize that they're around them unless you draw their attention to them. They are surrounded by these wonderful creatures with these beautiful songs and these fascinating lives. They don't even know or see that they are there. They just don't have the eyes to see. And yet he went on to explain he can't not see them. He's trained to look for them, and he's always aware of them. He's always hearing them. He can hear the songs. He's aware of where they might show up, right? He is trained and his eyes to pay attention to the birds that are obvious, and the wealth of information is there, but most of us don't even see them, let alone know anything about them or know anything about the wonders in this bird watcher's eyes of what's around them. And I think there's a lot of parallels to this in the way God tends to work. Most of the time, we are looking for something very different, and we miss the fact that God is working around us. He is blessing, He is causing good things to happen. We look right past the wonderful and the beautiful things that God is up to because often they are subtle or slow, or we're just so used to it, we take them for granted. We don't know the glories of what God is up to that are all right around us. Like Elijah in this story, right? Elijah totally misses the fact that God is revealing something new to him, that God is sustaining him even in the wilderness for this spectacular, anti-spectacular event because he doesn't see it. He doesn't know what to look for. He's just looking for the big, the grand, the spectacular. Maybe he's angry because he's looking for results, the people changing their hearts and lives en masse. And God is going about it in a very different way. And I think that's something we have to recognize when we assume that God has to work in spectacular, obvious ways. When we think that God is not working, if we cannot see the results, we are almost always going to end up being disappointed with God and God's ways. And there is so much disappointment in our lives that I think is unnecessary when often the birds are around us. When God's work is around us, we just don't have the right eyes. We don't have the right ears to hear God's voice. We're looking for something that tends not to be the way God works. We don't know God well enough to know his preferred methods and his preferred timings. And so we're angry and we're frustrated and we're confused, like Elijah finds himself in this story. And so, moving on in the story, I think God is going to give him a hint of what he is up to, that some of those results he's expecting are coming. They're just coming about in a very different way because, again, Elijah has kind of the wrong eyes. And so in the very end, we get this, right? He makes his complaint again. I'm the only one who is left. And then the first thing God says is, no, you still have a purpose. You still have a job. Go and do some anointing. Anoint Jehu, Nimshi's son, as the king of Israel. Anoint Elisha to succeed you as a prophet. Go to Damascus and anoint Hazael, right? And then he tells him at the end, whoever escapes from these various swords, the things are going to happen. And yet I've preserved those who remain in Israel, totaling 7,000, all those whose knees haven't bowed down to Baal and whose mouths haven't kissed him. And so two things I think are important here. One, he says, go. You still have purpose. Although it doesn't look like you were expecting, I'm using very different circumstances. You were expecting this big, spectacular thing where you were kind of the center of attention to be what gets the results, right? I'm going to use circumstances. I am going to use some very unscrupulous characters. We're going to meet most of these people who become king, whether they're from foreign nations in Damascus, whether it's the next king of Israel. These are not people you expect God to be using, right? These are monsters. There's no way around it. These are people who will be responsible for violence and genocide. And I don't think the Bible is saying God is approving of what they do. And yet the judgment, the darkness that God has judged will be answered with kind of their own swords, with violence, right? And yet each of these things is something in which Elijah will have his hand on. He will anoint Elisha as his successor, but it's in fact Elisha who's going to anoint the other two guys. He's actually the work is going to be done through weird circumstances, through very unscrupulous individuals. And yet it requires some faith from Elijah. God will work, it's just not directly through him. It's not in the way he expected. And he rebukes that kind of claim as well. I'm alone, I'm the only one. God goes, no, you're not the only one. I'm going to get my purposes done. They're just not in the ways you were expecting, in the timing you were expecting, in the ways you were expecting. And so I think that there is an encouragement in that, no, you're not alone, even though it feels like it. There are others suffering and going through this as well, but there's also a rebuke there as well. Whereas Elijah might have thought he was so important, he was the only one who could do God's will, God says, I don't actually need you to accomplish my things. I will get things done my own way, in my own timing. And so I think this lesson is one that's important for us because we often do find ourselves confused and frustrated when we think that something is going this way, when we think we are important, when we feel alone or like failures. Are we willing to see the ways that God actually works? Do we trust that God does good work even through very unusual tools, like people we don't like, people who frighten us or are morally ugly, through circumstances, through long timing in which we won't even get to see the results? Do we trust that God does work, that God provides for us even in places of wilderness, even if his ways are quiet and confusing and subtle? Will we trust God in his ways of doing work? Will we begin training ourselves to see the work that God is up to all around us? Or will we kind of fall into that old snare of believing that God must do big, flashy, obvious work for it to be God's work? A question we all, I think, need to almost continually be asking ourselves.